There's a moment that freezes you. A prime minister walking calmly through thousands of strangers. No bodyguards pushing through, no stages, no speeches, just a man in a crowd, smiling. Now picture this. South of the border, the president can't even hold a parade without a wall of fences and fear surrounding him. These aren't two politicians, they're two philosophies of power. And this story, this contrast, is the very heart of where North America is heading. On a warm summer evening in Alberta, something unusual happened. There wasn't a rally, there wasn't a motorcade, there was just Prime Minister Mark Carney, walking through the Calgary Stampede. No flashing lights, no military drums, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there were ranchers and families, oil workers and veterans, teenagers snapping selfies, elders offering handshakes. And Carney, taking it all in. One conversation, one handshake at a time. He didn't arrive with blaring music or screaming supporters. He arrived as if he belonged there. Because he did, while others see crowds as voters or threats. Carney sees them as people. It wasn't just a political move. It was a message, and not a subtle one. At a time when many leaders fear transparency, Carney chose proximity. At a moment when most heads of state guard themselves with glass and guns, this man walked into one of Canada's most politically charged provinces, and he listened. Let's be clear, this wasn't a campaign stunt. He wasn't chasing applause. He was inviting trust. We've been conditioned to believe that leadership comes from spectacle, rallies, podiums, televised drama, but Carney's presence at the Stampede shattered that illusion. He wasn't center stage. He wasn't even the loudest man in the room. But he was the most powerful. Why? Because he didn't need to be the loudest to be heard. He flipped pancakes with volunteers. He made a casual purchase at a local fudge shop. He asked questions about energy, listened to concerns about inflation, nodded at passing comments from skeptical locals. This wasn't optics. It was orientation. Carney was facing the public, not with a mic, but with humility. Contrast that with what's happening in America. Just days earlier, on the 4th of July, some celebrations were cancelled altogether. Why? Because citizens, legal citizens, families, veterans, and volunteers were too afraid to show up. Not because of terror threats, not because of public health, but because they feared their own government. Let that sink in. In El Sereno, a neighborhood in Los Angeles, the 4th of July parade was cancelled. 90% of participants dropped out, not because they stopped loving their country, because they no longer felt safe in it. These weren't radicals, these were church-goers, small business owners, veterans, patriots, people who'd flown flags all their lives suddenly found themselves wondering if being seen in public on Independence Day was worth the risk. Risk of what? ICE raids, questioning, profiling, surveillance. That's what Trump's America had become for them. A country where patriotism was punished if it came from the wrong kind of American. Where Carney walked through a crowd to shake hands. Trump's shadow loomed so large it silenced entire communities. This isn't about immigration policy. This is about fear replacing freedom. And fear, once installed, doesn't go away quietly. It lingers. It seeps. It poisons. Let's not sugarcoat it. Trump didn't create American distrust, but he capitalized on it like no president before him. Where Carney finds strength in public proximity, Trump finds power in emotional isolation. Trump doesn't walk through crowds. He commands them. He doesn't build consensus. He manufactures division. Under his presidency, law and order became a slogan used not to protect peace, but to control people. Especially the ones who don't fit the mold of his political base. When a country cancels parades not out of protest but out of panic, that's not law enforcement, that's psychological warfare. And while Trump held his Independence Day speech surrounded by tanks and walls, Carney was in Alberta, with no script, no rally, no force field, just hands to shake and people to hear. Let's go back to Calgary for a moment. This is Alberta, a province that's long been skeptical of federal leadership. Especially from the east, especially from Ottawa, but Carney didn't just show up. He engaged. He didn't demand loyalty. He earned respect, even among critics of Trudeau's climate policies, even among oil workers who've clashed with Ottawa for years. What Carney brought was rare, a listening ear, not a pointed finger. In an environment where politics usually feels like war, Carney walked in and chose peace. He didn't run from hard conversations, he ran toward them. And something remarkable happened. People responded, not with applause, with conversation. That's more powerful than any speech. Meanwhile, what did Trump do? He staged counter-events to protests. He held rallies in places where dissent was unlikely. He called critics enemies. He labeled dissent fake news. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Where Carney accepts criticism, Trump denies it. Where Carney uses presence to de-escalate tension, Trump inflames it to stay relevant. And the results speak volumes. In Canada, even as regional debates heat up, there's still a sense of unity. In the US, even basic celebrations of national pride now come with caveats, side eyes, and fear. That's not normal. That's not democracy functioning. That's democracy fraying. There's a line in leadership few people recognize until it's crossed. It's the difference between stepping aside to let your people shine, and stepping on their backs to keep your spotlight. Carney's entire approach signals a deep understanding of that line. He doesn't push himself into every photo. He doesn't turn every moment into a branding opportunity. Instead, he walks into spaces where people feel ignored and listens. And in doing so, something revolutionary happens. He makes room for others to be seen. That's what real leadership does. It elevates without overshadowing. Contrast that with Trump's governing style, which revolves around him and only him. Every policy is a reflection of his grievance. Every tweet, a declaration of dominance. Every disagreement, a betrayal. Let's talk about trust. Trust is invisible. It doesn't come from speeches. It comes from consistency. Mark Carney didn't win Alberta's cautious support by pandering. He didn't promise the moon and deliver slogans. He showed up. He asked questions. He offered transparency. And over time, even critics began nodding in quiet agreement. Not because he changed his values. Because he explained them. Compare that to Trump, who led through a constant state of siege. From the moment he took office, it was always war. War with the media, war with the courts, war with immigrants, war with his own staff, war, even, with science and truth itself. That's not leadership, that's paranoia given a podium. And paranoia spreads faster than policy. Go back to that cancelled parade in Los Angeles. That wasn't just a local story. It was a national red flag. When 90% of your participants drop out, that's not a protest. That's a community holding its breath. That's a silence so loud it should have shaken the halls of Washington. But it didn't, because Trump doesn't hear fear. He only hears applause, or opposition. The quiet terror of citizens deciding it's safer to stay home than to celebrate freedom. That never made it to his Twitter feed. And yet, it defines everything his presidency became. A rule built on fear, and a silence that became submission. Let's go back to the Stampede one last time. Look closely, not at Carney. Look at the people around him. No riot gear, no barriers, just laughter. A child pulling his arm for a photo. A vendor handing him a bag of fudge. A veteran nodding in recognition. You can't fake that. That isn't PR. It's presence. It's earned. In today's world, politics has become a performance. Loud voices, dramatic gestures, choreographed outrage, it's theater. And Trump was, without question, its leading actor. Every tweet, every rally, every chant was engineered for reaction. Not policy, not progress, but pure attention. He knew the headlines would follow his volume, not his values. But Mark Carney, he took the opposite path. He wasn't trying to win the day's news cycle. He was trying to win the decade's trust. Where Trump needed cameras, Carney needed conversations. Where Trump dominated rooms, Carney opened them. This difference, between noise and nationhood, is what separates real leadership from reality show governance. You see, the loudest leaders often hide the most fear. Fear of being irrelevant, fear of being exposed, fear of admitting they don't have all the answers. Carney doesn't pretend to know everything. He listens, he adjusts, he learns, and in doing so, he builds something far more lasting than headlines: credibility. Let's turn to one of the most surprising elements of Carney's leadership, his reception in Alberta's energy sector. This is oil country. This is blue-collar backbone. This is a region where Ottawa is often whispered like a curse word. And yet, Carney walked into that space not as a preacher, but as a partner. He didn't come with ultimatums. He came with ears. And the result? Qualified approval. That may not sound dramatic, but in a province hardened by decades of political skepticism, that's monumental. Think about it. A prime minister from eastern Canada walks into Alberta, speaks about climate, and walks out with support. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when you treat people like allies instead of obstacles. Trump could never do that. He governed with a scorched earth mentality. If you're not with him, you're against him. He demanded loyalty, not partnership. And in doing so, he fractured coalitions that had taken generations to build. Carney is building his differently. Not on charisma, but on coherence. Not with flash, but with follow-through. Meanwhile, back in Alberta, a political fire was beginning to spark. The Premier, emboldened by regional frustrations, floated the idea of a referendum. The goal: pull back provincial authority from the federal government, reassert control, challenge Ottawa. In political terms, this could have been an earthquake. A federal leader under normal circumstances might respond with force, rhetoric, or retaliation. But Carney didn't flinch. He didn't escalate. He didn't turn it into a fight. Instead, he responded with what seemed like stillness. Measured, careful, calm. He acknowledged the concerns. He didn't dismiss the anger. But he also didn't give it more oxygen than it deserved. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Because real leadership understands that not every fire should be fought with more fire. Sometimes, presence is stronger than pushback. And in that moment, Carney showed that he wasn't afraid of dissent. He welcomed it, he worked with it, he absorbed it, and because of that, Canada stayed united. Contrast that with the Trump approach, where every disagreement became a declaration of war. Where even Republican governors who questioned him became targets. Where states were punished for political disobedience. Where federalism was turned into factionalism. That kind of leadership doesn't unite. It isolates, it erodes, it breaks nations from within. Let's zoom out for a second and ask, what defines a country's relationship with its leader? Is it how loud they cheer, or how freely they gather? In Canada, at the Stampede, people gathered naturally. There was no fear, no tension, just curiosity and connection. A prime minister walking calmly through crowds of strangers. That doesn't just happen. That happens when a nation feels safe with its leadership. In America, meanwhile, something terrifying took hold. The very act of public gathering became fraught with risk. Not because of external threats, but because of internal ones. Immigration raids, profiling, street-level panic. And the scariest part, it didn't start from the bottom. It started from the top. A government that made certain citizens feel like suspects. Where waving an American flag became a potential trigger for scrutiny. Where ice vans replaced ice cream trucks at parades. Where the 4th of July turned into the 4th of silence. That's not just bad optics. That's national trauma. And trauma doesn't heal with a campaign speech. It heals with trust, with presence, with leadership like Carney's. You know what never lies? Crowd energy. In Alberta, people didn't shout Carney's name. They whispered it. That might sound underwhelming in today's world of social media virality. But in politics, whispers matter more than cheers. Whispers are real. Whispers are earned. Whispers mean, this guy gets it. They mean, he may not be perfect, but he's trying. Trump's rallies were loud. They had signs, chants, red hats, and cameras. But many of the policies behind that noise left people silenced. Families separated, neighbors deported, communities scared. And while the rallies grew louder, the nation grew quieter. That's the paradox of performative power. It drowns out truth. Carney's power is different. It's not volume, it's vibration. It resonates long after the handshake ends. Let's talk about the concept of photo ops. Most politicians love them. They plan them meticulously. They frame them, light them, choreograph them down to the second. But Carney's appearance at the Stampede wasn't that. He wasn't preening for photographers. He wasn't flanked by handlers whispering lines into his ear. He was present, authentic. That's why when he visited the fudge shop, it wasn't viral. It was meaningful, because it wasn't for the camera, it was for the people. Contrast that with Trump's infamous photo op at the church, Bible in hand, streets cleared by force. One image, captured at the expense of dozens injured. One staged moment of power, bought with fear. That's the price of fake leadership. It looks real, but it costs everything. Carney's leadership philosophy isn't revolutionary. It's actually quite simple. He treats the nation like a neighborhood. He doesn't walk into communities to dominate. He enters them like a neighbor would, through the front door, with a handshake, a question, maybe a joke. And that simplicity is what makes it radical. Because in an era where politics feels like warfare, Carney makes it feel like conversation again. He's not perfect, no leader is. But in a world of stage managers and digital illusions, his approach feels honest. That's why even his critics don't accuse him of being fake. Because whatever else he might be, he's there. Not hiding behind fences, not blaring on loudspeakers, not tweeting rage at 2 a.m. He's walking through crowds. Engaging, present, and that, more than any press release, builds a country's heart. Let's return, one last time, to those cancelled parades in America. The Latino communities that stayed indoors. The veterans who refused to march. The families who left their flags in the closet, not because they stopped loving their country, but because their country stopped loving them back. Trump claimed to restore pride, but what he restored was paranoia. People started looking over their shoulders at the very parades meant to unite them. That's not patriotism, that's panic dressed up in red, white, and blue. It's what happens when leadership becomes performance. When law becomes intimidation, when power becomes punishment. The America that once danced in the streets on Independence Day, now hides behind locked doors. That isn't politics, that's heartbreak. In the mirror of history, every leader eventually sees their reflection. Trump's reflection will be a wall, tall, divisive, expensive, and ultimately, symbolic of everything he feared, not what he achieved. Carney's, it's a walkway, not a wall, one that leads through markets, parades, even opposition territory. Not to claim it, but to understand it. That's the difference. That's why when history turns back the page, these two men will not be seen as two sides of the same coin. They'll be remembered as different currencies altogether. So, what happens when a prime minister chooses to walk among his people? While a president hides behind fences? What happens when leadership becomes about presence, not projection? What happens when policy becomes personal, and people become more than props? You get a nation that breathes. You get a country that doesn't just survive politics. It transcends it. Canada isn't perfect, but under Carney's presence, it's becoming something too rare to ignore. Sincere, stable, and maybe, just maybe, a model for what leadership should feel like again. And America, it's at a crossroads. The next chapter hasn't been written yet, but maybe, just maybe, it should start with putting down the megaphone and stepping into the crowd.